In this segment, we're going to take a look at the post-war outcomes of World War II. We need to keep in mind that wars have political, economic, and social consequences. We'll first take a look at the boundary issues as Europe was divided up. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had forces occupying most of Eastern and Central Europe and the eastern portion of Germany. These nations included Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and Yugoslavia, and part of Austria. As the Soviets pressed in to defeat the Nazi-occupied territory, they left their soldiers behind as though they had conquered new lands. And even though the Soviets had promised free elections to occur in these nations, the United States and the rest of the Western Allies were very suspicious, as each nation seemed to choose communism as its form of government. What made things a little bit more strange was that it was the Red Army of Joseph Stalin who was conducting these elections. At the conclusion of World War II, these nations that I mentioned earlier became known as satellite nations. They seemed to be run by puppet governments that were controlled by the Soviet Union. As we take a look at this map, this bold orange line running down the center was called the Iron Curtain by Winston Churchill. And that was the line that separated the Soviet-dominated eastern portion with the pro-Western western portion of Europe. A very critical division happened right there in Germany. Germany had to be partitioned, that is, divided after the war. The Soviets, as I mentioned, have dominated Eastern Germany as they marched in to defeat Hitler. And as they left their soldiers behind, this partition, this division, was along the lines of where the Soviet army happened to be. West Germany became a democratic nation, and it resumed self-government only after a couple of years of American and British and French occupation. The idea for the Western Allies was that a strong, vital Germany would become a good trade partner and be better for the rest of the world. East Germany, which stayed dominated by the Soviet Union, did not adapt democratic principles, and they stayed in a Soviet-style communist government, holding their allegiance to the Soviet Union. And a particular problem happened right here in the capital city of Berlin. Berlin was also divided into an east and a west. This posed a particular problem for West Germany. As you recall from the map earlier, West Berlin was entirely inside of East Germany. This map indicates that division of Berlin after World War II. Now, the original plan was to unify the city and the entire nation, but the Soviet Union refused to relinquish control of its portion of the city, and the red area, as I mentioned, became East Berlin, the capital of East Germany, and the western portion, where the French, the British, and the Americans were, became West Berlin and the capital of West Germany. Europe lay in ruins at the end of World War II. Incredible bombing campaigns, the death and the destruction. The United States and its Western allies felt that if Europe were rebuilt as quickly as possible, the world could get on to bigger and better things and grow again. So the Marshall Plan is where the United States was going to provide a massive financial aid package to help rebuild the European economies to the tune of $12.5 billion. And by the way, that's $1947. So $12.5 billion was the largest humanitarian aid package in our history up to that time. Now, this is going to be an attempt not just to rebuild the economic interest, but also as a means to help stop the spread of communism. We wanted to provide a link of friendship. As these nations were facing incredible economic hardships, we wanted to show that we were their friends, not the Soviet Union. And even though this plan was made available to the nations in Eastern Europe, that is, the Soviet satellites, every single one of them, including the Soviet Union, refused economic assistance. And that was an order that came directly from Moscow. Even though this was incredibly expensive and highly controversial at the time, it was very, very successful. As the western portions of Europe were rebuilt, they became very strong allies of the United States and became very strong trading partners as well. But this wasn't the only place where we saw death and destruction. Remember, America was fighting essentially two wars during World War II, and we needed to help rebuild Japan. Japan was economically and morally crushed, absolutely defeated, and occupied by American forces. At the conclusion of World War II, the United States and other nations imposed very strict limitations on Japan after the war. That is, limitations on their economy, limitations on their military, limitations on what they could do. It was General MacArthur who was left with the responsibility to oversee the rebuilding of Japan and organizing their new government. As they wrote their new constitution, many even today refer to it as MacArthur's Constitution. It's very closely modeled after the United States Constitution. When Japan rebuilt, it was limited especially in their ability to make war. Their army and navy were restricted significantly in size and power, so much so that they could never be strong enough to wage war, only that they could be strong enough to protect themselves. Japan had been imperialist, and that's what led directly the United States into the war, and we, as well as the other nations in Asia, felt that Japan needed to be strictly limited. And while Japan could have taken this as a sign of defeat and been very bitter about this, they realized that America was going to be the protector. After all, we emerged from this war as a very strong nation, the only nation with an atomic bomb, and we would assume the role to protect them. And with a strong protector like the United States, the money that they would not need to be investing in safety, in their army, in their navy, could now be freed up to invest in other resources. And so instead of focusing on maintaining their armed forces, they could utilize their resources to develop a much stronger economy, go into research and development, build factories, and essentially modernize. Since World War II, the nation of Japan has become one of America's strongest trading partners in the entire world. It would have been nice had there been a way to prevent the outbreak of World War I. It would have been nice to have had something in place to prevent the outbreak of World War II. After all, the League of Nations, which was created after World War I, failed miserably. After World War II, the United States learned our lesson, and we engaged in creating this thing called the United Nations. Its general purpose is to provide a way for all nations of the world to work together to solve problems to prevent war, a place where we can come to an agreement, where we can air our differences and come to a peaceful solution. It was formed in 1945, and it was very similar in concept to the League of Nations, however, given a little bit more power. Its first meeting happened in San Francisco, and today the United Nations lives in New York. Its charter was created by the victorious Allies, and the United States, as I mentioned before, learned its lesson. This time, the United States is going to take an active role in the United Nations to prevent any such problem. The conclusion of World War II brought on a new kind of war. This marks the beginning of America's entry into what's called the Cold War. And the Cold War is that set of animosities, that incredible tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Certain themes and ideas and vocabulary words we need to keep in mind as we discuss the Cold War is containment. Containment is the idea that the United States wants to contain, that is, stop the spread of communism. We don't need to roll it back. We simply need to prevent it from spreading. One of our fears with containment is the domino theory. We feel that if any nation, regardless of its size, if any nation falls to communism, then its neighbor may soon fall, and then its neighbor, and then its neighbor, and eventually knock on the doors of the United States. Another important theme is collective security. That is, using a strong alliance system to prevent an aggressive nation. To say that if an attack on one nation is considered an attack on all nations, that will prevent smaller skirmishes. Don't forget, this was one of the major problems that led us into World War I. We also are going to engage in the idea of massive retaliation, the threat of complete and total war as a deterrent to an attack. And that's going to be used in order to keep the peace. President Eisenhower is going to make this very, very popular. And of course, with the idea of massive retaliation, you must have a strong military, and that's going to encourage the arms race. That is the rapid buildup of weapons in the military to deter an attack. After all, if your opposing nation has more military power than you do, chances are you don't want to fight. And in the years that followed, we're going to engage in this thing called brinkmanship. That is, we are going to live on the brink of war. If we exist at that state of near war, each side is going to take incredible care to preserve that delicate and fragile peace. That either side is going to be afraid to take a strong action lest World War III would break out. In this segment, we're going to take a look at Cold War containment policies and how the United States responded to the threat of communist expansion. As we look at the origins of the Cold War, we need to understand that the Cold War is going to set the framework for global politics for the 45 years after the end of World War II. It's going to influence our domestic policies and the way we conduct foreign affairs and how much of a role the United States government should play in the economy. The Cold War was essentially a competition between two very different ways of organizing the government, society, and the economy. The American-led Western nations' belief in democracy and individual freedom and the market economy versus the Soviet belief in a totalitarian state and socialism. As I mentioned, the Cold War lasted from the end of World War II, 1945, until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. The United States and the Soviet Union represented starkly different fundamental values. The United States, again, a democratic political institution, generally a free market economic system. And the totalitarian Soviet Union had a communist or a strongly socialist economic system. The Truman Doctrine, that is, the idea of containment of communism, was going to become the guiding principle of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Not to roll it back, mind you, but to keep it from spreading, to resist communist aggression in other countries so that it does not infringe on our allies and then ultimately on ourselves. Let's take a little refresher look at the Cold War themes. The idea of containment to stop the spread of communism. The domino theory, the idea that if one nation falls to communism, its neighbors would fall. Collective security, the idea of a defensive alliance system, that an attack on one will be an attack on all. Massive retaliation, using the threat of complete war to deter an attack. An arms race, the rapid buildup of weapons to prevent an attack, showing that you're stronger than your enemy. And brinkmanship, that is, living on a near state of war so that each side will take great care not to upset the balance. We've talked about Europe becoming divided, but the world also formed into two divided camps. On one side we have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was formed as a defensive alliance among the United States and the Western European countries to prevent Soviet expansion, to prevent their invasion of Western Europe after World War II. Again, if any one nation would be attacked, it would be considered an attack on all. The blue nations on this map represent NATO. The Soviet Union didn't wait long to respond. They created what's called the Warsaw Pact. That was the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe, and they lasted for nearly 50 years. Both sides maintained very large military forces that faced off against each other across the Iron Curtain. The defensive alliance system for the Soviet Union provided a buffer zone in case the Western nations attacked, which they desperately were afraid of. And it produced, again, two very large armed camps in the war. And all it would take would be a simple spark, like the one that led into World War I, but a simple spark could throw the United States and the rest of the world into World War III. Most people believed that spark was going to happen in Berlin. After the Soviet Union matched the United States in nuclear weaponry in the 1950s, the threat of nuclear war that would destroy both countries was ever present throughout the Cold War. America, under President Eisenhower, adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter any nuclear strike by the Soviets. One of the hot spots that we really needed to pay attention to during the Cold War was China. China was taken over by the communists shortly after World War II, and the increased American fears of a communist domination of most of the rest of the world was now very real. China was the largest and most populated nation in Asia and had been a strong ally of the United States. But this guy, Mao Zedong, led a communist revolution in 1949. And this was described by America as a terrible loss for us. After all, if they're communist, they're no longer a valued trade partner. They're no longer a military partner in Asia. But rather than being strong allies with the Soviet Union, the communist nations of China and the Soviet Union started to split. And they eventually became rivals, where the Soviet Union would try to exert its influence on China, and China would push back and say, no, thank you, we have our own way. This worked out very well for the United States. This split was encouraged by President Richard Nixon in the 1970s, actually visited China to ease our relations with China, and then, of course, put extra pressure on the evil Soviet Union. However, in spite of us encouraging this split, China was communist. Another hotspot that we must address is Korea. We're actually going to come and fight a hot war in Korea. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, a north and a south. The North Koreans were communist. They share a border with China. The South Koreans are democratic. They tend to support the United States and the Western allies. And American involvement in the Korean War in the early 1950s is going to represent our policy of containment. That is to say, to stop the spread of communism. Here's how it worked. The Korean War began when communist North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And as you can see by this map, the North Koreans pushed deep into the South by September of 1950. At that moment, the United Nations realized that we needed to step in and do something. After the communists invaded North Korea, the American military forces led a counterattack that was also included other United Nations nations, and a counterattack that drove deep into North Korea. And as you can see by where the green represents, that represents our counterattack. We pressed them way back. By November of 1950, the United States and the UN forces are on the border of China and poised, ready to move in. However, Shortly after that, the Chinese forces joined in the fight. The Chinese backed North Korea and pressed backward and threatened to widen it. And eventually, we stopped that counterattack at the original line of the 38th parallel. A stalemate was drawn. Now notice the dates along the bottom. 1950, 1950, 1950. Most of the fighting took place as far as changing hands. However, between 1951 and 1953, for 2 years, the United States-led forces fought the Chinese and North Korean forces at the cost of over 50,000 American lives. The Korean War. It was certainly a move of containment. Eventually, an armistice was drawn, and that boundary line stayed. If we take a look at Korea today, it is still divided along the 38th parallel, with a communist north and a pro-Western south. The armistice agreement is still in effect. It has held up. Though Americans are still stationed there, we are not necessarily poised on the front line ready to attack. Sporadically, every couple of years, shots may be fired back and forth across the border, but for the most part, the armistice has stayed solid. More recently, North Korea has threatened world peace by building and testing nuclear weapons. And this nuclear proliferation is going to threaten world peace, as they are very close to China, which is a possible attack site, very close to Japan, and also to South Korea. And remember that the United States is still engaged in a protectorate role over Japan, that an attack on Japan would be considered an attack on the United States.